Leela first noticed the small, unassuming restaurant on the corner of a quiet street in her hometown when she was just 11. The building looked a little worn around the edges, with peeling paint on the sign and a squeaky door that jangled an out of tune bell every time someone walked in. It was the kind of place people mostly overlooked, hurrying instead to the bigger, fancier cafes down the road. Yet, despite its shabbiness, there was something about the place that Leila found inviting. Back then, she didn't dare go in alone. She was still a shy child, uncertain of herself and prone to second guessing every move. But her mother would sometimes stop in after grocery shopping. At first, it was just for a quick coffee or a slice of pie, but eventually these pit stops became regular mother-daughter moments. The booths were upholstered in a faded red vinyl, and the diner's linoleum floor featured a pattern so outdated it felt nostalgic. There was always a subtle hum of conversation and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with a hint of cinnamon from the pastries, familiar and cozy in a way many high-end restaurants could never replicate. Years later, Layla found herself drawn to that same corner eatery. She was now 25, living in a cramped studio apartment nearby, trying to make ends meet as a teaching assistant at the local middle school. On tough days, she would duck into the restaurant after work, usually with a stack of papers to grade, and sit at a table near the window. There, the chatter of the few patrons and the friendly smiles from the waitresses reminded her that hard days could still be softened by simple kindness. It was one of those hard days when it all happened. Leela had just finished an exhausting parent-teacher conference. A student in her class, Damien, had been struggling academically and socially, and she'd met with his father, who seemed as exhausted as she felt. The whole conversation circled around Damien's increasing anxiety and the financial issues that made it difficult for his father to help him access extra resources. Layla sympathized, but there was only so much she could do without the school's support. Feeling powerless, she sought refuge in the corner restaurant. She settled into her usual booth. The late afternoon sun filtered gingerly through the window. She drummed her pen against her notebook, reviewing the notes from the meeting. She wanted to think of something, some small gesture that might encourage Damien. In her downtime, she often wrote letters to herself, small affirmations that reminded her to keep going when life felt difficult. That afternoon, she flipped to a spare sheet of stationery and carefully scribbled a short message. You may feel lonely and overwhelmed now, but you're stronger than you believe. Keep going, one day at a time. You matter. By the time she finished writing, Leela glanced at the clock and realized she needed to head home. Not one to leave clutter, she scooped up the note, got ready to slip it back into her notebook, then paused. A very quiet but insistent part of her mind urged, what if you left it? She looked around. Only two other customers remained. One was an older man nursing a cup of coffee. The other was a teenage girl engrossed in her phone. The note wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, and it was just a small piece of encouragement. Should she simply leave it behind? It felt strange, but also hopeful. Layla made up her mind. She tucked the note under the empty sugar container near the edge of the table. She paid her bill and left the diner, wondering who might discover her words. Without fully understanding why, she found herself smiling on the way out to the street. That little note stayed hidden for a while. By the time the waitress came round to clear the table, she discovered it half peeking from behind the sugar dispenser. She nearly threw it out, assuming it was a leftover scrap, but something made her open and read it. The words hit her with unexpected resonance. The waitress, Fiona, had been worried about making rent that month. She was picking up extra shifts, feeling disconnected from her friends and home life because of the constant hustle. She read, you may feel lonely and overwhelmed now, but you're stronger than you believe. Keep going, one day at a time. You matter. The note, clearly intended for no one in particular, and therefore, somehow, for everyone, offered her a small sense of comfort. She tucked it into her apron pocket. During her break, Fiona showed it to Thomas, the restaurant's manager, a quiet, soft-spoken man who had inherited the place from his father. The words made Thomas smile. That's kind of nice, isn't it? He commented. Then, after a thoughtful moment, he offered, Maybe we can leave it out for someone else to find. Day by day, a little encouragement can go a long way. Fiona agreed. She took the slip back out and returned it to the edge of a different table, this time tucking it beneath the salt shaker so it wouldn't be immediately thrown away during the hectic dinner rush. She even scribbled a small heart on the back corner of the paper, as if adding her own silent well wish. That evening, a tired traveling salesman, Peter, sat at that table while waiting for his burger. When he saw the note, he moved it aside initially, not intending to read it. He was more focused on his phone, tapping out emails and scrolling through missed calls. But once the waiter placed a glass of water in front of him, Peter noticed the note again. He was about to place it aside properly when he thought, why not see what it says? He read the scribbled sentence. Then he reread it. The words reminded him of home. He hadn't been back in 4 weeks and felt an ache for the family he rarely saw. On a whim, after finishing his meal, he took out his own pen and wrote on the back of the same piece of paper, "Today might feel heavy, but there's always a reason to smile. I promise you're not alone." He left it for whoever dined next. There was no grand plan attached to this little act, just a feeling that maybe, somehow, it could speak to someone else who needed it. The small note was acquiring layers, carrying not one voice, but two. Over the following days, the note moved from table to table, sometimes lost for a day, only to be discovered by a curious waiter or a staff member diligently wiping surfaces. People read it in moments of boredom or desperation. A few found it silly and placed it aside. Others found a flicker of hope. One mother, out for dinner with her kids, added a short phrase of gratitude for her family. Another woman, who was newly divorced and feeling bleak about her future, wrote a line about resilience. Within a week, the single sheet had begun to tear at the edges from so many hands reading and rereading it. But the sentiments remained. Eventually, the small paper grew so full of ink that there was no more space to add words. Fiona, noticing it was reaching its end, took another piece of stationery from the register. She carefully copied the original lines, along with some of the newly added messages, onto a fresh page. It wasn't a perfect duplicate, but enough of the encouraging notes were preserved. The old tattered slip was gently retired in an envelope behind the counter, a memento. Because fresh paper was now pinned under the salt shaker, it became easy for others to keep adding new lines. Strangers who never learned each other's names began leaving words of comfort, thanks, hope, or simple jokes. They wrote from the heart, sometimes short and sometimes more like paragraphs, addressed to you, yet belonging to no one in particular. Many ended their notes with a friend or love, a stranger. Gradually, a new tradition formed in this little restaurant. Every so often, when a page filled up, the manager tucked it away in an envelope and laid out a new one. At first, a few guests thought it was a gimmick. Maybe the restaurant was trying to look artsy or different. But soon they realized the staff hadn't advertised anything and didn't require anyone to participate. Some regular patrons started checking in on the notes, scanning the new lines to see if a phrase or a story clung to their heart. Others, after finishing their meals, simply read quietly and left without adding anything. The powerful thing about it was that each person was free to engage in their own way. As August rolled into September, Layla visited the diner in the late afternoon for a warm drink between classes. She'd been too busy to come regularly, so it had been at least a month since she'd last dropped by. When she slid into her usual booth, she noticed a piece of paper near the middle of the table, pinned under a heavy salt shaker, filled top to bottom with handwriting. Curious, she picked it up and started to read. Immediately, her stomach fluttered. These words, they had the same tone as the message she'd once scribbled and left behind. You may feel lonely and overwhelmed now, but you're stronger than you believe. Keep going, one day at a time. You matter. Her eyes welled with unexpected tears. She followed each line and discovered additions from so many strangers. Some had doodled hearts or flowers in the margins. Someone had scribbled a short poem. Another person wrote about coming out of a dark place in life, reminding whoever read it next that even the worst storms eventually pass. There were lines of encouragement about confidence, forgiveness, gratitude. The entire piece of paper was covered in the echoes of healing words. all anchored by that first note. Leela pressed a hand to her mouth, blinking quickly. She felt a strange mixture of awe and humility. She had left that first note on a whim, feeling powerless and hoping to give someone else a small spark of hope. Never did she imagine that seed would multiply into a garden of anonymous kindness. The realization made her heart swell with gratitude. Thomas, who knew Leela by face, though not by name, who happened to walk by, he spotted her reading the paper in silence and smiled softly. Assuming she was just another curious newcomer to the tradition, he asked if she was enjoying it. "It's amazing," Leela said. How? How did it start?" He tapped the paper lightly, glancing at the original words. "No one knows for sure, but those first lines appeared a couple months ago, and folks just kept adding to them. A chain of positivity, I guess." Layla didn't correct him on who'd written the original note. It felt more fitting to remain anonymous. She was proud, yet a little shy about it. She was also deeply touched by how this small idea had grown bigger than her alone. Rather than claiming ownership, she decided to celebrate that it belonged to the whole community now. During the following weeks, a delicate ripple of change began spreading outward from that cozy corner restaurant. Patrons picked up the idea and started leaving random notes of encouragement on coworkers' desks, in books at the public library, or pinned to bulletin boards around town. A single mother discovered a note on her shopping cart at the grocery store that said, "You are stronger than your circumstances." A college student who felt isolated in a dorm far from home opened a library book and found a folded slip of paper that read, "Don't give up, someone cares." The phenomenon didn't happen in a dramatic, viral way. Instead, it was subtle, like a gentle wave. Almost everyone who participated did so quietly, content to remain a nameless contributor, leaving messages that might bring a small spark of joy into someone else's day. It fostered a soft sense of unity among strangers. It turned out that people loved the chance to do something kind without expecting credit. Fiona continued to copy over the diner's whispers of hope whenever a page became full. They eventually accumulated into a small binder that sat behind the counter. If a customer asked about the notes, she or Thomas would let them leaf through past pages, discovering messages from unknown neighbors. Their diner, once unremarkable save for its out-of-tune bell, was becoming a quiet pillar of positivity in the neighborhood. Layla's life took a few new twists during this time. Her contract as a teaching assistant wasn't renewed for the next year, and she had to say goodbye to her students at the end of the semester. She worried about job prospects. Despite her uncertainties, she found strength in the messages she read on the diner's tables. On evenings she felt hopeless, she remembered that first line she had written, "You matter." It comforted her to know that in giving encouragement, she had also received it back 100-fold. With a bit of perseverance and luck, she eventually secured a position at the local nonprofit that supported at-risk youth. It wasn't a teaching job, but it meant she could continue helping children like Damien. The first day of her new job was nerve-wracking, yet exciting. Her colleagues were warm and passionate about their mission. One afternoon, Layla introduced the idea of leaving anonymous, encouraging notes around the community center for kids to find. The supervisor loved it, and soon posters and small bits of stationery were placed in safe corners, inviting anyone to write something uplifting to a friend or a stranger. It caught on faster than Layla expected. Children, by nature, found a sort of magic in the possibility that an unknown friend might write them something kind. One girl, tall for her age but shy in spirit, wrote, "Sometimes I feel like nobody sees me, but I will keep trying." Another boy responded with, "I see you, don't give up." The notes multiplied, pinned to bulletin boards, or even taped to corners of the rec hall. Reading them became part of many kids' daily routines. In the midst of this wave of kindness, the story of the diner quietly evolved. More customers were hearing about that place with the notes. Some folks dropped by just to read them and eat a piece of pie. Thomas, ever humble, never tried to make the notes a commodity. He didn't want to turn a sincere act of compassion into a commercial gimmick. So he kept everything low-key, letting people discover the notes on their own. One autumn evening, Damien's father returned to the restaurant. Over the summer, things had started to get a bit better for them. Damien had found support at the community center and they'd managed to receive a small grant for tutoring, but life was still challenging. The father sat down and absent-mindedly picked up the slip of paper from the table. The front read, "Healing is a process. You'll get there at your own pace." On the back was something scribbled in looping handwriting. "Don't underestimate the light you bring to others. Someone is thankful for you today." He felt tears threaten to spill. Lately, he had worried that he was failing as a single parent, working two jobs and not always able to be there for Damien. He had no idea that Leela was the original author of this diner tradition or that she had specifically tried to encourage his son in that parent-teacher conference months ago. All he knew was that these words felt like they were written for him by someone who understood what he was going through. He stayed a little while, sipping his coffee, letting his emotions settle. Then he wrote a brief message of his own, hoping that somewhere another parent, maybe a father, in the same situation would find comfort. "You're doing the best you can, and that's enough," he wrote. "Don't forget, you're allowed to rest," a fellow parent. As the weeks went on, it became routine for him to stop by the diner whenever he felt especially tired or uncertain. He would read the new notes and sometimes add his own. A few other regulars, from business people to truck drivers, did the exact same thing. The messages kept evolving, inspiring some to mend relationships or reach out to old friends. Every so often, Fiona or Thomas would catch wind of a small miracle, a customer who found a reason to keep going, or someone who decided to apologize instead of nurse a grudge. They attributed it all to the power of shared empathy. For them, this was more valuable than any tip or glowing restaurant review. Meanwhile, Layla noticed the movement expanding beyond just the diner or the community center. She began spotting upbeat words taped to lampposts or pinned to the notice board at the grocery co-op. "Smile at yourself in the mirror. You deserve kindness today." Or, "Mistakes are proof you're trying. Keep trying." Each note was a witness to a growing sense of connection in the town. It was as if people had finally found an unintrusive but genuine outlet for their wish to help one another. One morning, the local newspaper placed a small feature on the phenomenon in its Sunday edition. They didn't have a name for it, maybe because no one had officially organized it, but the article described it as a quiet revolution of caring. A handful of restaurants in neighboring areas had started the practice as well. A wave of positivity, they called it. While it might have been overshadowed by the heavier news stories of the day, anyone who read it found a reason to hope that small acts could indeed change the atmosphere of a community. Leela kept to her routine of visiting the diner most weekends. It became her safe space to reflect. She would order a lemon scone or a mug of hot tea, settle into a booth, and read the latest notes. She never told anyone she started the first note. Part of her thought that kind of recognition could take away from the open-hearted spirit of the project. She had needed encouragement on that fateful day just as much as anyone else. It felt good to remain part of the circle rather than step outside it as the creator. Sometimes local children would come in with their parents and gravitate toward the notes. One day, a little girl tapped Leela's shoulder and asked if she knew what the slips of paper were for. Trying not to give away her personal attachment, Leela explained they were messages of kindness left by strangers. "Can I add one?" the girl asked, her face glowing. "Of course," said Leela gently, passing the girl one of the blank slips. Fiona placed a pen next to it. The girl, with wobbly handwriting, wrote down, "You are perfect the way you are." Then she added 3 bright stars and her name, Becky. "I guess it's not really anonymous," she giggled. "But that's okay." She waved goodbye, leaving the note behind. Layla felt a lump at the back of her throat. Seeing that sense of wonder in a child who contributed one simple line reminded her of how even the smallest, simplest expressions of positivity could be the most profound. Becky's note would be read by someone else, possibly an adult who felt anything but perfect. And maybe, for just a moment, they'd see themselves through the eyes of a sweet, honest child. The tradition endured through winter when the restaurant was often quiet. People still added notes, sometimes referencing holiday good cheer or New Year's resolutions. It lasted through storms and power outages, always returning once the lights flickered back on. Spring came, and with it, a fresh wave of bright colored stationery that Fiona introduced for the changing season. By then, the binder behind the counter was nearly full. During all this, the idea of finding a note in Willowbridge, the little town, had turned into an unspoken event. Children would keep their eyes open for them at the park or the library. Adults would sometimes tuck a note into their pockets, intending to leave it on a colleague's desk. People shared the story quietly, sincerely, with no fanfare. Whenever life felt heavy, they would remember. There's encouragement out there if you only look for it, or take a moment to create it for someone else. Layla continued working with at-risk kids, encouraging them to believe in themselves and sign up for scholarship programs. She spent hours after school tutoring them. Sometimes her coworkers wondered what fueled her. In her heart, she knew part of it was the feeling she'd had the day she wrote that first note in the diner, the determination to remind any lonely person that they weren't alone. The memory of that slip of paper, circulated by strangers, kept her going. One evening, as she was refilling her tea, Lila noticed Thomas waving her over. He had rummaged in the binder behind the counter and pulled out the very first sheet, now tattered and coffee-stained, edges taped to preserve the writing. "We've been saving these," he said. "They're almost like a local treasure." Layla traced her finger gently over the original words she had penned. "You may feel lonely and overwhelmed now, but you're stronger than you believe. Keep going, one day at a time. You matter." And next to it, the writing of others in swirling lines. "You're not alone. Always a reason to smile. You are enough." The page was more ink than blank space. Layers of voices that had found solace in offered solace in return. Thomas asked if she wanted to read through it, and she did. She spent a few minutes letting the world melt away, focusing on that piece of paper. When she finally looked up, she found him smiling. "I can see this means a lot to you," he said softly. "It does," she admitted, tears shining in her eyes. "I can't explain it, but it's like reading a handwritten conversation of hope." He nodded. "I'm just glad people found each other in it." Layla set down the paper carefully. So many hands had touched it, so many hearts poured out onto it. It was living proof that humans could be kind and vulnerable without needing applause. "Thank you for keeping this safe," she said. "It's worth more than gold." And it truly was. For in this worn diner, on those humble tables with sugar dispensers and well-worn menus, an entire community's hidden tenderness had found expression. Nobody needed to sign their names. Nobody needed a grand statement. The lines of text themselves, raw at times, uncertain, yet ever hopeful, was enough. They reminded anyone who cared to listen that a single gesture of compassion could spark a tradition capable of uplifting countless souls. Leela left that evening feeling lighter, waves of gratitude carrying her down the sidewalk. As she closed her car door, she glanced back at the windows of the little restaurant. Inside, a pair of young friends were reading the latest paper together, smiling at something written along the margin. The warm yellow glow from the overhead lights illuminated their faces, making them look almost ethereal. She imagined the words weaving themselves into those two friends' conversations, buoying them in small but meaningful ways. A sense of calm settled over her heart. That was enough to show her how good still thrived in everyday life, and how simple it could be to nurture it. She had learned through the miracle of a forgotten piece of paper that hope multiplied when shared. And as she drove away, she silently prayed that the notes would keep circulating across tables and over counters, to find each new person who needed an anonymous reminder that the darkness does not last forever and that indeed they mattered.